Hey guys, Adam Savage here. Thought I would read for you today one of my favorite books, Franny and Zooey by J.D. Salinger. I thought I'd start at the beginning of Zooey and read up to the end of Buddy's letter. So two men arguing outside. Sorry if that's a disturbance. The facts at hand presumably speak for themselves, but a trifle more vulgarly, I suspect, than facts ever usually do. Sorry, I just got a text. As a counterbalance, then, we begin with that ever-fresh and exciting odium, the author's formal introduction. The one I have in mind not only is wordy and earnest beyond my wildest dreams, but is, to boot, rather excruciatingly personal. If, with the right kind of luck, it comes off, it should be comparable, in effect, to a compulsory guided tour through the engine room, with myself as guide, leading the way in an old one-piece Janset bathing suit. To get straight to the worst, what I'm about to offer isn't really a short story at all, but a sort of prose home movie, and those who have seen the footage have strongly advised me against nurturing any elaborate distribution plan for it. The dissenting group, it's my privilege and headache to divulge, consists of the three featured players themselves, 2 female, 1 male. We'll take the leading lady first, who, I believe, would prefer to be briefly described as a languid, sophisticated type. She feels that things might have gone along well enough if I had just done something about a 15 or 20-minute scene in which she blows her nose several times, snipped it out, I gather. She says it's disgusting to watch somebody keep blowing her nose. The other lady of the ensemble, a svelte twilight soubrette, objects to my having, so to speak, photographed her in her old housecoat. Neither of these two lovelies, as they've hinted they'd like to be so called, takes any very shrill exception to my overall exploitive purposes. For a terribly simple reason, really. If, to me, a somewhat reddening one. They know from experience that I burst into tears at the first harsh or remonstrative word. It's the leading man, however, who has made the most eloquent appeal to me to call off the production. He feels that the pilot hinges on mysticism, or religious mystification in any case. He makes it very clear, a too vividly apparent transcendent element of sorts, which he says he's worried can only expedite, move up, the day and hour of my professional undoing. People are already shaking their heads over me, and any immediate further professional use on my part of the word God, except as a familiar healthy American expletive, will be taken, or rather, confirmed as the very worst kind of name-dropping, and a sure sign that I'm going straight to the dogs. Which is, of course, something to give any formal faint-hearted man, and particularly writing man, pause. And it does, but only pause. For a point of objection, however eloquent, is only good as it is applicable. I think I hear Brett coming in. The fact is, I've been producing prose home movies, off and on, since I was 15. Somewhere in The Great Gatsby, which was my Tom Sawyer when I was 12, the youthful narrator remarks that everybody suspects himself of having at least one of the cardinal virtues, and he goes on to say that he thinks his, bless his heart, is honesty. Mine, I think, is that I know the difference between a mystical story and a love story. I say that my current offering isn't a mystical story or a religiously mystifying story at all. I say it's a compound or multiple love story, pure and complicated. The plotline itself, to finish up, is largely the result of a rather unholy collaborative effort. Almost all of the facts to follow, slowly, calmly to follow, were originally given to me in hideously spaced installments and in, to me, somewhat harrowingly private sittings by the three-player characters themselves. Not one of the three, I might well add, showed any noticeably soaring talent for brevity of detail or compression of incident. A shortcoming, I'm afraid, that will be carried over to this, the final or shooting version. I can't excuse it, regrettably, but I insist on trying to explain it. We are, all four of us, blood relatives, and we speak a kind of esoteric family language, a sort of semantic geometry in which the shortest distance between any 2 points is a foolish circle. One last advisory word. Our family surname is Glass. In just a moment, the youngest Glass boy will be seen reading an exceedingly lengthy letter, which will be reprinted in here in full, I can safely promise, sent to him by his eldest living brother, Buddy Glass. The style of the letter, I'm told, bears a considerably more than passing resemblance to the style or written mannerisms of this narrator, and the general reader will no doubt jump to the heady conclusion that the writer of the letter and I are one and the same person. Jump he will, and I'm afraid, jump he should. We will, however, leave this Buddy Glass in the third person from here on in. At least I see no good reason to take him out of it. 10:30 on a Monday morning in November of 1955, Zooey Glass, a young man of 25, was seated in a very full bath, reading a 4-year-old letter. It was an almost endless-looking letter, typewritten on several pages of second-sheet yellow paper, and he was having some little trouble keeping it propped up against the 2 dry islands of his knees. At his right, a dampish-looking cigarette was balanced on the edge of the built-in enamel soap couch, and evidently it was burning well enough, for every now and then he picked it off and took a drag or two, without quite having to look up from his letter. His ashes invariably fell into the tub water, either straight away or down one of the letter pages. He seemed unaware of the messiness of the arrangement. He did seem aware, though, if only just, that the heat of the water was beginning to have a dehydrating effect on him. The longer he sat reading or rereading, the more often and the less absently he used the back of his wrist to blot his forehead and upper lip. In Zooey, be assured early, we are dealing with the complex, the overlapping, the cloven, and at least 2 dossier-like paragraphs ought to be got in right here. To start with, he was a small young man and extremely slight of body. From the rear, particularly where his vertebrae were visible, he might almost have passed for one of those needy metropolitan children who are sent out every summer to endowed camps to be fattened and sunned. Close up, either full face or in profile, he was surpassingly handsome, even spectacularly so. His eldest sister, who modestly prefers to be identified here as the Tuckahoe homemaker, has asked me to describe him as looking like the blue-eyed Jewish-Irish Mohican scout who died in your arms at the roulette table at Monte Carlo. A more general and surely less parochial view was that his face had been just barely saved from too handsomeness, not to say gorgeousness, by virtue of one ears protruding slightly more than the other. I myself hold a very different opinion from either of these. I submit that Zooey's face was close to being a wholly beautiful face. As such, it was of course vulnerable to the same variety of glibly undaunted and usually specious evaluations that any legitimate art object is. I think it just mains to be said that any of 100-year-day menaces, a car accident, a head cold, a lie before breakfast, could have disfigured or coarsened his boundless good looks in a day or a second. But what was undiminishable, and as already so flatly suggested, a joy, a kind of forever, was an authentic spirit superimposed over his entire face, especially at the eyes, where it was often as arresting as a harlequin mask, and on occasion, much more confounding. By profession, Zooey was an actor, a leading man in television, and had been for a little more than 3 years. He was in fact as sought after, and according to vague second-hand reports that reached his family, as highly paid. As a young leading man in television, perhaps can be who isn't at the same time a Hollywood or Broadway star with a ready-made national reputation. But possibly either of these statements, without elaboration, can lead to an overly clean-cut line of conjecture. As it happened, Zooey had made a formal and serious debut as a public performer at the age of 7. He was the second youngest of what had originally been 7 brothers and sisters, 5 boys and 2 girls, all of whom at rather conveniently spaced intervals during childhood had been heard regularly on a network radio program, a children's quiz show called It's a Wise Child. An age difference of almost 18 years between the eldest of the Glass children, Seymour, and the youngest, Franny, had helped very considerably to allow the family to reserve a kind of dynastic seating arrangement at the Wise Child microphones, which lasted just over 16 years, from 1927 well into 1943, a span of years connecting the Charleston and B-17 eras. All this data, I think, is to some degree relevant. For all the gaps in years between their individual heydays on the program, it may be said, with few and no really important reservations, that all 7 of the children had managed to answer over the air a prodigious number of alternately deadly bookish and deadly cute questions sent in by listeners with a freshness and aplomb that was considered unique in commercial radio. Public response to the children was often hot and never tepid. In general, listeners were divided into 2 curiously restive camps: those who held that the Glass were a bunch of insufferably superior little bastards that should have been drowned or gassed at birth, and those who held that they were bona fide underage wits and savants of an uncommon, if unenviable, order. At this writing, 1957, there are former listeners to It's a Wise Child who remember with basically astonishing accuracy many of the individual performances of each of the 7 children. In the same thinning but still oddly coterie-like group, the consensus is that of all the Glass children, the eldest boy, Seymour, back in the late 20s and early 30s, had been the best to hear, the most consistently rewarding. After Seymour, Zooey, the youngest boy in the family, is generally placed second in order of preference or appeal. And since we have a singularly workaday interest in Zooey here, it may be appended that as an ex-panelist on It's a Wise Child, he had won almanac-like distinction among, or over, his brothers and sisters. Off and on, during their broadcasting years, all 7 of the children had been fair game for the kind of child psychologist or professional educator who takes a special interest in extra precocious children. In this cause or service, Zooey had been, of all the Glasses, hands down, the most voraciously examined, interviewed, and poked at. Very notably, with no exceptions that I know of, his experiences in the apparently divergent field of clinical, social, and newsstand psychology have been costly for him, as though the places where he was examined had been uniformly alive with either highly contagious traumas or just plain old-fashioned germs. For example, in 1942, with the everlasting disapproval of his 2 eldest brothers, both of whom were in the Army at the time, he had been tested by one research group alone in Boston on 5 separate occasions. He was 12 during most of the sessions, and it's possible that the train rides, 10 of them, held some attraction for him, at least in the beginning. The main purpose of the 5 tests, one gathered, was to isolate and study, if possible, the source of Zooey's precocious wit and fancy. At the end of the 5th test, the subject was sent home to New York with 3 or 4 aspirins in an engraved envelope for his sniffles, which turned out to be bronchial pneumonia. Some 6 weeks later, a long-distance call came through from Boston at 11:30 at night, with much dropping of small coins in an ordinary payphone, and an unidentified voice, with no intention, presumably, of sounding pedantically waggish, informed Mr. and Mrs. Glass that their son Zooey, at 12, had an English vocabulary on an exact par with Mary Baker Eddy's, if he could be urged to use it. To resume, the long typewritten 4-year-old letter that Zooey had checked into the bathtub with on this Monday morning in November 1955 had obviously been taken out of its envelope and unfolded and refolded on too many private occasions during the 4 years, so that now it not only had an overall unappetitlish, wow, I don't know that word, appearance, but was actually torn in several places, mostly along the creases. The author of the letter, as stated earlier, was Zooey's eldest living brother, Buddy. The letter itself was virtually endless in length, overwritten, teaching, repetitious, opinionated, remonstrative, condescending, embarrassing, and filled, to a surfeit, with affection. In short, it was exactly the kind of letter that a recipient, whether he wants to or not, carries around for some time in his hip pocket, and that professional writers of a type love to reproduce verbatim. Start of letter. Dear Zooey, March 18th, 1951. I've just finished decoding a long letter that came from Mother this morning, all about you and General Eisenhower's smile and small boys in the Daily News who fall down elevator shafts, and when am I going to have my phone in New York taken out and get one installed up here in the country where I really need it. Surely the only woman in the world who can write a letter in invisible italics. Dear Bessie, I get 500 words of copy from her like clockwork every 3 months on the subject of my poor old private phone and how stupid it is to pay good money every month for something nobody's ever even around to use anymore, which is really a big fat lie. When I'm in town, I invariably sit talking by the hour with my old friend Yama, the god of death, and a private phone's a must for our little chats. Anyways, please tell her I haven't changed my mind. I love that old phone with a passion. It was only really private property Seymour and I ever had in Bessie's entire kibbutz. It's also essential to my inner harmony to see Seymour's listing in the goddamn phone book every year. I like to browse through the G's confidently. Be a good boy and pass that message along for me. Not quite word for word, but nicely. Be kinder to Bessie, Zooey, when you can. I don't think I mean because she's our mother, but because she's wary. You will after you're 30 or so, when everybody slows down a little, even you maybe, but try harder now. It isn't enough to treat her with the doting brutality of an Apache dancer towards his partner, which she understands. Incidentally, whether you think so or not, you forget that she thrives on sentimentality almost as much as Les does. My telephone problems aside, Bessie's current letter is really a Zooey letter. I'm to write and tell you that you have your whole life before you, and that it's criminal if you don't go after your PhDs before you go in for the actor's life in a big way. She doesn't say what she'd like you to get a PhD in, but I assume math rather than Greek, you dirty little bookworm. At any rate, I gather that she wants you to have something to fall back on if for some reason the acting career doesn't work out. Which may be very sound, and probably is, but I don't feel like coming right out and saying so. It happens to be one of those days where I see everybody in the family, including myself, through the wrong end of a telescope. I actually had to struggle at the mailbox this morning to know who Bessie was when I saw her name on the return address of the envelope. For one good enough reason, Advanced Writing 24A loaded me up with 38 short stories to drag tearfully home for the weekend. 37 of them will be about a shy, reclusive Pennsylvania Dutch lesbian who wants to write, told first person by a lecherous hired hand in dialect. I take it for granted you know, for all the years I've been moving my literary whore's cubicle from college to college, I still don't even have a BA. It seems a century ago, but I think there were two reasons, originally, why I didn't take a degree. Just kindly sit still, this is the first time I've written to you in years. One, I was a proper snob in college, as only an old wise child's alumnus and future lifetime English major can be, and I didn't want any degrees if all the ill-read literates and radio announcers and pedagogical dummies I knew had them by the peck. And two, Seymour had his PhD at an age when most young Americans are just getting out of high school, and since it was too late for me to catch up with him in style, I wasn't having any. Of course, too, I knew for certain when I was your age that I'd never be forced to teach, that if my muses failed to provide for me, I'd go grind lenses somewhere, like Booker T. Washington. In any particular sense, though, I don't think I have any academic regrets. On especially black days, I sometimes tell myself that I'd loaded up with degrees when I was able. I might not now be teaching anything quite so collegiate and hopeless as Advanced Writing 24A, but that's probably bunk. The cards are stacked, quite properly I imagine, against all professional aesthetics. And no doubt we all deserve the dark, wordy, academic deaths we all sooner or later die. I do think your case is a lot different from mine. Anyway, I don't think I'm really on Bessie's side. If it's security you want, or that Bessie wants for you, your MA will at least always qualify you to pass out logarithm tables at any dreary boys' prep school in the country and most colleges. On the other hand, your beautiful Greek will do you almost no good at all on any good-sized campus unless you have a PhD, living as we do in the brass hat, brass mortarboard world. But the more I think of it, the more I think to hell with more degrees for you. The fact is, if you want to know, I can't help thinking you'd make a damn sight better adjusted actor if Seymour and I hadn't thrown you in the Upanishads and the Diamond Sutra and Eckhart and all our other old loves with the rest of your recommended home readings when you were small. By rights, an actor should travel fairly light. When we were kids, S and I once had a beautiful lunch with John Barrymore. He was bright as hell and full of lore, but he wasn't burdened down with any of the cumbersome luggage of a too formal education. I mentioned this because I was talking to a rather pompous Orientalist over the weekend, and at one point, during a very deep, metaphysical lull in the conversation, I told him I had a little brother who once got over an unhappy love affair by trying to translate the Upanishad into classical Greek. I wish to God I had some idea what will happen to you as an actor. You're a born one, certainly. Even our Bessie knows that, and surely you and Franny are the only beauties in the family. But where will you act? Have you thought about it? The movies? If so, I'm scared stiff that if ever you gain any weight, you'll be as victimized as the next young actor into contributing to the reliable Hollywood amalgam of prizefighter and mystic, gunman and underprivileged child, cowhand and man's conscience, and the rest. Will you be content with that standard box office schmaltz, or will you dream of something a little more cosmic? Playing Pierce or Audrey in a Technicolor production of War and Peace, with stunning battlefield scenes, and all the nuances of characterization left out, and Anna Magnani daringly cast as Natasha, and gorgeous incidental music by Dmitri Popkin, and all the male leads intermittently rippling their jaw muscles to show they're under great emotional stress, and a world premiere at the Winter Garden under floodlights, with Molotov and Milton and Beryl and Governor Dewey introducing the celebrities as they come into the theater. How does that sound? And if you go into the theater, will you have any illusions about that? Have you ever seen a really beautiful production of, say, The Cherry Orchard? Don't say you have. Nobody has. You may have seen inspired productions, competent productions, but never anything beautiful. Never one where Chekhov's talent is matched, nuance for nuance, idiosyncrasy for idiosyncrasy, by every soul on stage. You worry hell out of me, Zooey. Forgive the pessimism, if not the sonority, but I know how much you demand from a thing, you little bastard. And I've had the hellish experience of sitting next to you at the theater. I could so clearly see you demanding something from the performing arts that just isn't residual there. For heaven's sake, be careful. Granted, I'm off today. I keep a good neurotics calendar, and it's 3 years to the day since Seymour killed himself. Did I ever tell you what happened when I went down to Florida to bring back the body? I wept like a slob on the plane for 5 solid hours, carefully adjusting my veil from time to time. Carefully adjusting my veil from time to time so that no one across the aisle could see me. I had a seat to myself, thank God. About 5 minutes before the plane landed, I became aware of people talking in the seat behind me. A woman was saying, with all of Black Bay, Boston, and most of Harvard Square in her voice. And the next morning, mind you, they took a pint of pus out of that lovely young body of hers. That's all I remember hearing. But when I got off the plane a few minutes later, and the widow came out towards me all in Bergdorf Goodman black, I had the wrong expression on my face. I was grinning, which is exactly the way I feel today, for no really good reason. Against my better judgment, I feel certainly that somewhere very near here, the first house down the road, maybe, there's a good poet dying. But also somewhere very near here, somebody's having a hilarious pint of pus taken from her lovely young body. And I can't be running back and forth forever between grief and high delight. Last month, Dean Sheeter, whose name usually transports Franny when I mentioned it, approached me with his gracious smile and bullwhip, and I am now lecturing to the faculty, their wives, and a few oppressively deep-type undergraduates every Friday on Zen and Mahayana Buddhism, a feat I haven't a doubt that will eventually win me the Eastern philosophy chair in hell. The point is, I'm now on the campus 5 days a week instead of 4, and what with my own work at nights and on weekends, I have almost no time to do any elective thinking, which is my plaintive way of saying that I do worry about you and Franny when I get a chance, but not nearly so often as I'd like to. What I'm really trying to tell you is that Bessie's letter had very little to do with my sitting down in a sea of ashtrays to write to you today. She shoots me some priority information about you and Franny every week, and I never do anything about it, so it isn't that. What brings this on is something that happened to me at the local supermarket today. I was standing at the meat counter waiting for some rib lamb chops to be cut. A young mother and her little girl were waiting around too. The little girl was about 4, and to pass the time she leaned her back against the glass showcase and stared up at my unshaven face. I told her that she was about the prettiest little girl I'd seen all day, which made some sense to her. She nodded. I said I'd bet she had a lot of boyfriends. I got the same nod again. I asked her how many boyfriends she had. She held up 2 fingers. 2, I said. That's a lot of boyfriends. What are their names, sweetheart? And she said in a piercing voice, Bobby and Dorothy. I grabbed my lamb chops and ran. But that's exactly what brought on this letter. Much more than Bessie's insistence that I write to you about PhDs in acting, that have a haiku-style poem I find in the hotel where Seymour shot himself. It was written in pencil on the desk blotter. The little girl on the plane who turned her doll's head around to look at me. With these 2 things on my mind, I thought as I was driving home from the supermarket that at long last I could write to you and tell you why S and I took over your and Franny's education as early as high-handedly as we did. We've never put it into words for you, and I think it's high time one of us did. But now I'm not so sure I can do it. The little girl at the meat counter is gone, and I can't quite see the polite face of the little doll on the plane. And the old horror of being a professional writer, and the usual stench of words that goes with it, is beginning to drive me out of my seat. It seems terribly important to try, though. The age difference in the family always seemed to add an unnecessarily and perversely to our problems. Not really between S and the twins and Boo Boo and me, but between the two twosomes of you and Franny and S and me. Seymour and I were both adults. He was even long out of college by the time you and Franny were both able to read. At that stage, we had no real urge to even push our favorite classics at the two of you. Not, anyway, with the same gusto that we had at the twins or Boo Boo. We knew there's no keeping a born scholar ignorant, and at heart I think we didn't really want to, but we were nervous, even frightened, at the statistics on child pedants and academic Weisenheimers who grew up in faculty recreation room savants. Much more important, though, Seymour had already begun to believe that education by any names would smell sweet, and maybe much sweeter if it didn't begin with a quest for knowledge at all, but with a quest, as Zen would put it, for knowledge. Dr. Suzuki says somewhere that to be in the state of pure consciousness, Satori, is to be with God before he said, "Let there be light." Seymour and I thought it might be a good thing to hold back this light from you and Franny, at least as far we were able, and all the many lower and more fashionable lighting effects, the arts, sciences, classics, language, till you were both able to at least conceive of a state of being where the mind knows the source of all light. We thought it would be wonderfully constructive to at least, that is, if our own limitations get in the way, tell you as much as we knew about the men, the saints, the arhats, the bodhisattvas, who knew something on every about this state of being. That is, we wanted you both to know who and what Jesus and Gautama and Lao Tzu and Sri Ramakrishna, etc. were before you knew too much or anything about Homer or Shakespeare or even Blake or Whitman, let alone George Washington and his cherry tree or the definition of a peninsula or how to parse a sentence. That, anyway, was the big idea. Along with all this, I suppose I'm trying to say that I know how bitterly you resent the years when S and I were regularly conducting home seminars, and the metaphysical sittings in particular. I just hope that one day, preferably when we're both blind drunk, we can talk about it. The paragraph should close, but I can't stop muttering. You'll wince at what comes next, but come it must. I think you know that I had the best intentions of checking in now and then after S's death, to see how you and Franny were holding up. You were 18 and I didn't worry about you overly, although I did hear from a gossipy little snip in one of my classes that you had a reputation in your college dorm for going off and sitting in meditation for 10 hours at a time, and that made me think. But Franny was 13 at the time. I simply couldn't move, though. I was afraid to come home. I wasn't afraid you'd both, in tears, take up a position across the room and fire the complete set of Max Muller's Sacred Books of the East at me, one by one. But I was afraid of the question you might both put to me, as I remember very well. I let a whole year go by after the funeral before I came back to New York at all. After that, it was easy enough to come in for birthdays and holidays, and be reasonably sure that questions would run to when my next book would be finished, and had I done any skiing lately, etc. You've even both been up here on many weekends in the last couple of years, and though we've talked and talked and talked, we've all agreed not to say a word. Today is the first time I've really wanted to speak up. The deeper I get into this goddamn letter, the more I lose the courage to my convictions. But I swear to you that I had a perfectly communicable little vision of truth. This afternoon, the very instant that child told me her boyfriend's names were Bobby and Dorothy, Seymour once said to me, in a crosstown bus of all places, that all legitimate religious studies must lead to an unlearning the differences, the illusory differences between boys and girls, animals and stones, day and night, heat and cold. That suddenly hit me at the meat counter, and it seemed a matter of life and death to drive home at 70 miles an hour to get a letter off to you. Oh God, how I wish I'd grabbed a pencil right there in the supermarket and not trusted the roads home. Maybe it's just as well, though. There are times when I think you've forgiven S more completely than any of us have. Waker once said something very interesting to me on that subject. In fact, I'm merely parroting what he said to me. He said you were the only one who was bitter about S's suicide, and the only one who really forgave him for it. The rest of us, he said, were outwardly unbitter and inwardly unforgiving. That may be truer than true. How can I know? All I do know for certain is that I had something happy and exciting to tell you, and on just one side of the paper, double-spaced, and I knew when I got home that it was mostly gone, or all gone, and there was nothing left to do but go through the motions. Lecture you on PhDs in the actor's life. How messy, how funny, and how Seymour himself would have smiled and probably assured me, and all of us, not to worry about it. Enough. Act, Zachary Martin Glass, when and where you want to, since you feel you must, but do it with all your might. If you do anything at all beautiful on a stage, anything nameless and joy-making, anything above and beyond the call of theatrical ingenuity, S and I will both rent tuxedos and rhinestone hats and solemnly come around to the stage door with bouquets of snapdragons. In any case, for what little it's worth, please count on my affection and support, at whatever distance. Buddy. As always, my passes at omniscience are absurd, but you, of all people, should be polite to the part of me that comes out merely clever. Years ago, in my earliest and pastiest days as a would-be writer, I once read a news story aloud to S and Boo Boo. When I was finished, Boo Boo said flatly, but looking over at Seymour, that the story was too clever. S shook his head, beaming away at me, and said cleverness was my permanent affliction, my wooden leg, and that it was in the worst possible taste to draw the group's attention to it. As one limping man to another, old Zooey, let's be courteous and kind to each other. Much love, Buddy.